Abraham Lincoln was alive today, what would he be famous for? Old age. What did Abraham Lincoln say when he was accused of a crime? I'm innocent. Oh, man. Yeah, if Lincoln was never president, America really would have gone south. Okay, enough. Enough. Enough, Mr. Bruce. Your jokes are just too much. We're laughing too hard. Okay. Everybody calm down. Calm down. I'm done with the jokes. All right. Today we're going to be talking about something called the Lincoln Douglas debates. And we'll finish with John Brown's raid. So we'll only do 3 slides. We're on slide 18 right now. So remember, Abraham Lincoln starts to make a name for himself nationally by speaking out against the Dred Scott decision. Now remember, Abraham Lincoln is not an all-out abolitionist. He's not someone who is going around saying slavery is evil and we need to get rid of it, right? That's what an abolitionist does. But Lincoln is a Northerner who has moral problems with slavery and believes that slavery should not spread to any other part of the country. He thinks slavery is like a cancer, right? We need to stop it from spreading. Right? He's not willing to say, yeah, we have to get rid of slavery in the South, but he is willing to say it's wrong to spread slavery anywhere else. Right? His longtime political rival, Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, does not feel that way. So Stephen Douglas is someone who believes in popular sovereignty on the slavery issue. And Stephen Douglas believes that it's good that Illinois doesn't have slavery, but he doesn't see anything wrong with Missouri having slavery. Right? Stephen Douglas says basically, we in Illinois have voted to outlaw slavery, and that's all well and good, but we have no business telling other states or other territories what to do with slavery. Right? So a lot of people, when they read about the Lincoln or they study the Lincoln Douglas debates, they make the assumption, the mistaken assumption, that Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery all the way and Stephen Douglas was pro-slavery all the way. It's not exactly true, right? They did disagree on slavery, but only insofar as if it should be allowed to spread in other parts of the country. Abraham Lincoln is also perceived as being anti-slavery because of what he does as president with the Emancipation Proclamation and the pushing of the anti-slavery amendments in the Constitution. And so for that reason, Lincoln is credited with freeing the slaves, which is true. Without Abraham Lincoln, slavery would have existed a lot longer than it did. He was the most important political force in removing slavery from the United States. So he absolutely gets credit for that, right? But don't think of him as an abolitionist. Even when he was president, he was not really an abolitionist, right? The Emancipation Proclamation is something he does more because he thinks he has to, not necessarily because he wants to. Although maybe by that point he did want to. All right. So Stephen Douglas is a rival to Abraham Lincoln in Illinois. So Abraham Lincoln serves a term in Congress, but he only serves 1 term and then he goes back to being a lawyer, right? He's not yet a Republican. Meanwhile, Stephen Douglas is a Democrat, and a strong Democrat, who is basically promoting popular sovereignty in the state of Illinois, or for the rest of the country. Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln kind of go back a while, right? They do not like each other. And one reason they don't like each other is because both Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln were trying to marry the same woman, Mary Todd, right? So this lady right here is Mary Todd. So when they were younger, both Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln met Mary Todd and were courting her. They were both trying to win her hand in marriage. And Mary Todd chooses Lincoln over Stephen Douglas because tall guys always win. Um, so, yeah, just had to throw that in there. Anyways, yeah, Mary Todd chooses Lincoln over Stephen Douglas, and there's bad blood between them because of this, right? Stephen Douglas feels kind of like humiliated by it. Abraham Lincoln is like, oh, this guy almost stole my wife. Well, before she was my wife. Right? Another reason Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln don't get along so well is because Stephen Douglas is the main author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which we've already studied. Right? Lincoln publicly opposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? And instead publicly embraces a lot of Republican policies against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So because Lincoln has this personal and political opposition to Stephen Douglas, Republicans decide to nominate him for Senate against Stephen Douglas when Stephen Douglas's term is over. So Stephen Douglas's term expires. Abraham Lincoln, remember, is not yet a Republican. He's a Whig. But the Republicans say, you're basically a Republican. And Abraham Lincoln's like, yeah, I guess so. And they say, all right, become a Republican, and we're going to nominate you to run against Stephen Douglas because he's going to run for another term in the Senate, in the United States Senate, representing the great state of Illinois, right? And Abraham Lincoln accepts this nomination for all the reasons I've already listed against Stephen Douglas. And during the campaign, there are a series of debates that get covered by the news media. And these are called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And these are considered sort of like the high point in how media covers political campaigns. Because basically what would happen is Lincoln and Douglas would have these debates out in the open. And there were no like news cameras there back then, of course. Instead, it was just reporters who were listening to what both sides were saying. They were repeating the arguments that both sides were saying, and they were publishing it in the newspapers. Lincoln and Douglas are both very skilled speakers and very skilled debaters. And they were also very passionate about the topics which they were debating. Thousands of people would gather to hear these debates. So these debates are very substantive. Unfortunately now, like if you watch any political debate, almost all the time it's just people saying a bunch of like bumper sticker slogans that don't really mean anything. Public debates on TV are just that. They're made for TV. They're made for an audience that really isn't going to pay attention to what the people are saying. It's just, who can get like the best insult in. That's usually what it's about now. That was not how it was during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They actually had like a formal structured debate and really got into the substantive matters at hand. All right. So they would debate about slavery, about race relations, and about popular sovereignty. And basically, Douglas was saying states have the right to popular sovereignty on the slavery issue. And he said, Abraham Lincoln, you're an abolitionist, right? And in response, Abraham Lincoln would say, I'm not an abolitionist, but popular sovereignty is a really bad idea because, and then he has this very famous quote, a house divided against itself cannot stand, right? In other words, popular sovereignty is going to hurt the nation because it's going to create more states on both sides of the issue. There's going to be more free states and more slave states. And this is just going to further divide the country. It's going to divide the country against itself. You can't have half the country allowing slavery and half the country not allowing slavery, not on an issue that is so hot button, so passionate, so fundamental to basic human liberty. Right? So he says either slavery needs to be legal everywhere or it needs to be legal nowhere. Right? So now we start to see more of Abraham Lincoln becoming the man we know as president, right? That sounds more like Abraham Lincoln, the president. Remember, before this, Abraham Lincoln just didn't want to see slavery expand anywhere. Now, Abraham Lincoln seems to be saying, yep, we're either going to have to allow slavery everywhere or we're going to have to find a way to get rid of it everywhere, Um, and he says it just doesn't make sense that depending on your geography, that determines whether or not you are a person or a piece of property, right? Why is it that if you live in Texas and you're black, you're property, but if you live in Minnesota and you're black, you are a person? That doesn't make any sense. Um, so Lincoln believed slavery was wrong. He wasn't an abolitionist, though, yet, because he believed slavery should die on its own. He didn't think the government should end slavery. He just thought that we shouldn't make any laws that will allow slavery to grow. Slavery is just going to naturally die out on its own in a few generations. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act is artificially keeping slavery alive. Right? It is important to note that Lincoln never believed that blacks were equal to whites during his lifetime. For example, he was not someone who probably, this is a bit speculative, but most historians would say Lincoln probably would not accept interracial marriage, for example, right? He would have a problem with that. Lincoln probably did not believe that black people should be, on average, just as wealthy as white people, for example. Right? He didn't think the two races were equal, but he did think that blacks, slave and free, were citizens of the United States. All right. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates made Lincoln really, really popular throughout the U.S. because it allowed him to show off his best attribute, which was his ability to publicly speak and be witty and clever and kind of make jokes on the fly, right? This is what Lincoln was known for, and it allowed him to show this off in front of newspapers and thousands of people that came to see him. However, even though Lincoln became very popular because of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas actually won re-election. So Douglas became the senator. Lincoln lost. However, the Republican Party didn't see this as a loss, because what they really wanted was to see if Abraham Lincoln had what it took to run a presidential campaign. And he passed with flying colors. He got national exposure from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. People all over the country knew who he was, and the Republicans said, this is who we want to run for president. He's smart, he's popular, he's a good speaker, he has the right views on slavery, meaning he's definitely not pro-slavery and he's definitely not an abolitionist, but the North is going to like what he has to say, and the South, even though they're going to feel threatened by him, they're not going to be able to call him an abolitionist, right? He's the right guy to run for president. So they nominate him to run for president, and we'll get to that election later. Meanwhile, it's the year 1859 now. Remember John Brown? John Brown is that crazy guy from Connecticut who moved into Kansas with a posse and killed a white father and his boys who were pro-slavery activists, right? So John Brown makes some noise again. John Brown this time brings a posse to Virginia, where there's a guy named Colonel Robert E. Lee, who's in charge of a lot of soldiers in Virginia, which is a slave state, right? And John Brown decides he's going to attack Robert E. Lee and his soldiers to try to give the slaves in Virginia a chance to revolt. John Brown's idea is, well, if I attack the military establishment in Virginia, it's going to create a lot of chaos, and this chaos is the exact opportunity slaves need in Virginia to revolt against their masters, because their masters aren't going to have backup from the military, because the military is going to be so busy fighting us. Right? John Brown's John Brown's attack on Robert E. Lee, though, fails miserably, because Robert E. Lee is a very, very crafty military leader. John Brown is captured. He's given a trial. The trial is given a lot of national attention, and then John Brown is hung. He's executed for his crimes.